All right, good afternoon, everybody that's joining us online. My name is Nathan Rolfe. I'm the president of the Association of U.S. Cyber Forces. I'm joined here by Dan Van Wagenen, our vice president, Mark Montgomery from the Foundation of Defense for Democracies. And online, we have Dr. Erica Lonergan. That's our two authors from the paper we're discussing today, United States Cyber Force, a Defense Imperative. Quick introduction about Association of U.S. Cyber Forces. AUSCF is a professional association, nonprofit for the cyber workforce nationwide, especially as it relates to national security. We provide the voice for our members to policy and decision makers at the federal and state governments, as well as advocate for new laws and policies that affect positively any changes into how we operate as a nation in cyberspace and how we can better secure all of our resources against cyber attacks. Dan, can you go ahead and introduce our guest today?
Most certainly. So coming from FDD, we have Mark Montgomery, retired Rear Admiral, who serves as Senior Director of the Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation, where he leads FDD's efforts to advance U.S. prosperity and security through technology innovation while countering cyber threats that seek to diminish them. Mark also directs CSC 2.0, an initiative that works to implement the recommendations of the congressional-mandated Cyberspace Solarium Commission, where he served as executive director. Previously, Mark served as policy director for the Senate Armed Services Committee under the leadership of Senator John S. McCain, coordinating policy efforts on national security strategy, capabilities, and requirements in cyber policy. Dr. Erica Lonergan is an assistant professor in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Previously, Erica held several positions at the United States Military Academy at West Point. These include serving as an assistant professor in the departments of social science and electrical engineering and computer science, a fellow at the Army Cyber Institute, and the executive director of the Rupert H. Johnson Grand Strategy Program. She also has held positions as a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Atlantic Council.
Thank you. Mark and Erica, thank you both for joining us. We're going to operate this as a type of fireside chat, so we'll ask a few questions. I'll try and alternate between Mark and Erica just so we can give that fair time to both of you. Please chime in as you need to online, Erica. Mark, on March 25th, you released a paper, actually this one right here, calling for the creation of an independent cyber force, and you actually had another online event discussing your findings and recommendations. Rather than completely rehash the paper, since you already had that event, can you go ahead and summarize what those findings and recommendations were to provide that baseline for our discussion today?
Yeah, thanks. And thank you both for having me here, and thanks to TAC for hosting it. And I'm glad Erica could join online. So I'll say first what it isn't. It is not a criticism of U.S. Cyber Command's ability to conduct employment of cyber forces. And I want to just make that quick distinction between force employment and force generation, because what we're going to talk about today is mostly force generation. There is a discussion to be had about Cyber Command's force employment, but that's not what this is today. And I think it's generally in better shape than force generation. This is, however, a heavy criticism of the individual military services force generation efforts. And it's not an equal criticism, just like it's not an equal performance across the services. But this is a criticism of our ability to recruit, onboard, train, maintain, and retain our cyber forces and the associated infrastructure they need to operate. We, after a detailed review, interviews with a large number of departing personnel from across all services, and we'll get into some details about that later. We came to a very solid conclusion that we need the status quo is not working in force generation for our cyber forces, and we need a significant change, and we certainly require an outside assessment of that need, outside the Department of Defense assessment of that need as soon as possible, as directed by probably the National Defense Authorization Act.
Eric, I'll throw a follow-on to you online. There's a number of other suggestions and models that have been posed out there for what to do about a cyber force and how to handle the force generation versus force employment piece. Why do you feel that the recommendations that were put forth in FDD's paper is actually the right path to go this time?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. I think that when we talk about alternative models, I think the SOCOM, Special Operations Command model, is typically the sort of natural foil to what we're suggesting, which is the creation of an independent uniform service for cyberspace. But as we talk about in the report, there are some real challenges with applying the SOCOM model to cyberspace, even if we set aside some of the demonstrable challenges that SOCOM in itself has faced over the years in terms of having these unique, how it's used its sort of unique service-like authorities for acquisitions. And what I see as being the real limitation of the SOCOM model is that the services are still presenting forces to U.S. Special Operations Command to be employed. But what's distinct about them is that there are unique domain-specific warfighting competencies across each of the services that only each service can provide to SOCOM, right? So an Army Ranger is uniquely trained for special operations on land. The same is true of a Navy SEAL and so on and so forth. But that same analogy doesn't extend to cyberspace. And so the case for still having service retained responsibilities in cyberspace for fourth generation, I think, is less convincing. I also think that there are some real challenges when it comes to what we are, if we're if Cyber Command is increasingly gaining service-like authorities and responsibilities, which has been the trend over the past several years, and looks like what will be the trend going into the future if there isn't a major change, is that it's really it's placing an enormous demand on the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, who has the responsibility not just in his combatant commander role, but also as director of the National Security Agency. And there have already been debates percolating in our community about whether the dual hat responsibility is sort of too much for one person. If you add another hat onto that role, which is effectively having sort of service-like responsibilities on top of commanding a four-star unified combatant command and directing the NSA, I think it creates a risk of empowering arguments in favor of splitting the dual hat. And regardless, is simply too much responsibility for one commander, regardless of how effective and competent they are.
Could I jump in on that? And so I think it's really interesting. I sometimes, because I hear about the SOCOM model, and a couple thoughts come to mind. The first is about recruiting. So let's say I'm an Army recruiter right now. I'm probably feeling a lot of heat. If I'm a Navy recruiter, I'm feeling even more heat. Both services significantly missed their mark in last calendar year. The Army by a quantitatively higher number, the Navy by a higher percentage. You didn't hear much about the Navy. They tucked their announcement in while the Army was catching flack, as any good DoD agency would do. But the truth is both services really are hurting for their recruitment. Now, look, when the Navy recruiter, the Army recruiter is at Washington Liberty High School trying to get somebody to join, they're to get the people they need, which is physically and mentally fit, which is a increasingly small percentage of the high school graduates, so somewhere in the 25 to 30% range. To have an effective chance of getting them, they're sitting outside the sports locker rooms, just so they can start with physically fit, and they're working it hard trying to get their thing. Now, if they're trying to get a SEAL or a Ranger, they'd be in the same spot. Unfortunately, to recruit what we need in Cyberforce, they need to be in a bunch of other places as well. They need to be outside the robotics lab. I kind of joke they have to be in wherever the hovel is, where the gaming room is, the e-gaming. They need to be at those spots. You're recruiting an essentially different person. And we know this because as they evolve and go into the more interesting jobs in their service career, even in their Zone A, even in their first term enlistment, they're needing to be, say they're at a unit where they're, writing software code for, exploiting open source software, putting malicious code in, things like that. We're very rapidly finding that, okay, so they got recruited in, at whatever, entry level we call it MEP or DEP, whatever it is by the services acronym. They're selecting their likely rating after boot camp. How they get cyber is based, not on what, like from using our cyber expertise, a NIST nice, 57 spotlight check sheet that said, do you have can you write Python? Are you C++? Can you do this? Yeah, this certification. Instead, it's like, hey, who knows computers? Or who's comfortable? Or who would be interested in cyber? And you get a hand raise. Well, now you fast forward to that squadron where they're having to write this malicious code. And we're being told by the commanding officers, hey, it's very unlikely that that the people we get can do the mission. And they literally 6 or 7% of the people at these units are doing the hard work, the writing the code. It doesn't make the other 92, 93, 94% bad people. They just weren't equipped with the tools necessary for this kind of success by the recruiting and onboarding. All right, just think about that. If I'm and then reverting back to when I was an admiral going around my units, if I walked into a squadron and the CEO goes, "Hey, great news, sir. Man, I got 30 pilots here. I have 5 fantastic Super Hornet pilots. The other 25 I don't use." That CO, his or her XO, and maybe the operations officer, they're all going down quickly, probably before I leave the ready room. You've got a serious, fireable offense. But it's the norm in cyber because this is really hard, because you need very specific skills. Now, could we grow those people skills over a zone A and some of a zone B reenlistment? You bet. But this would be the only field where we kind of lay that out, so starkly that we can't recruit the people we need. So I say, if you go to a cyber force, unlike SOCOM, you're actually recruiting a different service member with different rules. And then I would take a hard look at what are your go, no-go factors for entry into service, in terms of fitness, in terms of, what their skill sets were, what their high school grades were, what their ASVABs were. You're looking for very specific skills. And so, what their personal social choices were leading up to that. I think those all have to be in play as we kind of try to figure out, what does a cyber force look like? And then, you would recruit to that. And I think we'd have a lot better success in who we have in the service, how comfortable they are with the jobs we're giving them, and how much they want to, retain in the service after their first enlistment.
Circle back a little bit more on recruiting later on, but let's for now let's talk about a little bit, especially report. This is a conversation that the cyber service repeatedly for many years. This is reported.
So I'm hearing you say, what's the timing issue with this and and how's it play in the NDAA? I think your mic is breaking up a little
might
bit,
be, yeah.
but I'm repeating. I'll repeat. I'll repeat that and say, that's a good question. Look, we did try to push this last year, and we failed. But as I look at it for this year, we're going to come back in, try to make another under National Defense Authorization Act. This is not a hard ask. General Nakasoni's last word on this issue was the status quo is not acceptable. I don't think General Hawk has, in his short time, he was deputy beforehand. He was one of the functional commanders before that. I don't believe he's, standing on a hill saying the status quo is acceptable. I think we all understand the status quo is not acceptable. Part of the Cybercom 2.0 initiative is that it's not acceptable. But my answer is, my question then is, if it's not acceptable, and we've been working this for 12 years, and DOD's been asked 3 or 4 times by Congress to do its own assessment and has not come back, by the way, with anything that says the status quo is not acceptable. They've had multiple times to come clean on this and haven't. So what we're asking for is a very simple, get an outside assessment. It strikes me as very poor planning to say the current system's not functioning. We haven't been able to get our hands around it. We haven't been able to talk to Congress about what's wrong. But the one thing we do know is we don't want an outside assessment. That sounds about as untransparent as you can get. And if we're increasing your budget for infrastructure, for people, for operations, year over year over year, and we're not satisfied with the results, that's we, Congress, and the American people. You, DOD, should not be allowed to say back to us, that's fine, just don't give us an outside assessment. It's an easy ask. And look, if the outside assessment comes back and says some other solution is the right solution, then that's what it is. But I think that outside assessment, done, fairly is going to come back and say, hey, we need we need to at least consider a cyber force, or we need a cyber force, and allow the department to kind of respond to that line of questioning.
All right, I'll follow up a little bit with that, Erica, if you don't mind answering this one. Would the timing also of this assessment be perhaps influenced by the existence of U.S. Space Force? It's only been around a little over 4 years. We're still seeing challenges and significant building efforts being done with that service. Do you expect a lot of pushback, basically saying, hey, we just did this. There's no time to try and do another service or even look at it right now because of that?
Yeah, I mean, to be frank, I think that's a bit, I understand that argument, but I think it's a bit of a cop-out, right? I think if anything, not that your question is a cop-out, but but the line of reasoning is the cop-out. And that's only because I think the creation of Space Force only underscores and reinforces the argument for the creation of a cyber force. And what's interesting is that, and I was going back and doing some reading last week, rereading the Rumsfeld Commission from, 2000 or 2001 on space, right? And if you look at the language and the findings from that commission around the centrality of space for modern warfare, the fact that space doesn't have a sort of proponent within the DoD to advocate for the interests of space and so on, you could replace cyber for space, and the argument would resonate just as much, if not more so, right? So at this point, with the creation of Space Force, we now have an independent uniform service for every domain of warfare, with the exception of cyberspace. And so to me, I think that the timing of Space Force, I would, personally argue we probably should have had a cyber force before creating a Space Force, but, that's, we can't go back and change history, but looking forward, I think that that decision only underscores and strengthens the argument for a cyber force, so that we have our domains of warfare aligned with how the military organizes itself for force generation and force employment, right? So we have services that are responsible for organizing, training, and equipping personnel within their respective warfighting domains. And so I think we need to flip the onus around and ask, why would we say that cyber is different from any of the ways we organize ourselves for the other domains?
If I could jump in on that. First, I love the way you phrase that question. Well, this will be something we have to, an argument we have to counter. And what I would say is that we're going to have to counter every argument, because my gut reaction is DoD is going to take the spaghetti and throw it against the wall and hope that something sticks with enough senior congressional leaders to not be, so that they can not be transparent and not have this kind of discussion occur. And the Space Force one's kind of frustrating, because I have to tell you, I think Cyber Force, Eric is right. A Cyber Force probably should have gone before Space Force. Right now, we can, because of the FY 2019 NDAA, we can the military can plan and conduct cyberspace operations as a traditional military activity. We are conducting cyberspace operations with military units, around the world on a fairly routine basis across a number of operational plans. We're not conducting, kinetic operations from space. Now, it's a very enabling and supporting and critical, and I support a Space Force. But let's be clear: one of these areas is open for business and kinetic combat operations and for the employment of force from the domain, and the other isn't. It should be. I mean, there's a whole separate argument: can we use weapons from space, right? Which I would support, but that's not the current argument of this or any previous administration. So the irony is, we kind of, jumped the shark here and did Space Force first. But just because you did the order wrong doesn't mean you shouldn't do each of the elements. You should, that there's an intellectual argument in support of.
Can I just jump in on one more thing, if that's okay?
Absolutely.
Just in terms of timing, and one point that I wanted to make that I forgot to was that the reality is that we've doctrinally defined cyberspace as a domain of warfare since the early 2000s, right? The reality is our adversaries are already organizing and planning around cyber as being a key element of modern conflict. Our national defense strategy defines, China as the pacing threat and so on and so forth. And so we already know that this is a key element of modern conflict. And if there is some, I hope there isn't, right? But if there is some future contingency or crisis with a near peer or peer adversary, I think we would all be sort of regretting not having addressed these challenges now, right? Rather than having to address them after something bad has happened. And so again, that's another sort of a different line of reasoning when it comes to timing, is that now is actually the time to figure this out before we get to a situation where we wish we would have had one entity with the sole locus of responsibility for recruiting, retaining, training, educating, and so on personnel for conflict and inter cyberspace.
And one last thought: if you look back to post 9/11, and we realized we had to, with great speed, create the Department of Homeland Security, and now we step back 20 years later and say, how'd that go? I think most of us would say, well, that was a cluster, right? That was not how you would have built this federal, this overarching Department of Homeland Security. There's a need for a lot of corrective action there that's been required over time. You don't want to have to do something serious and important like this in a crisis response. You want to be able to do it in a thoughtful, meaningful way ahead of time. So a study to take a look at it, determine whether or not it's necessary, and then have an employment, come up with an employment strategy for doing it. I wouldn't say we're in peacetime now, but in kind of like a simmering conflict is the best way to do it. Not when we're in a boiling conflict, which is probably where we're going to end up doing it, as Erica mentioned.
I kind of want to go back to something that Erica touched on, and obviously this question is geared towards the both of you. But this thing we call cyber, the issues surrounding it, it's not just an American issue. All the world's nations have to come to terms with the cyber domain and their own national security. How do your recommendations compare to what other countries are doing, especially among both our allies and adversaries? And just as a quick follow-up to that, are we leading the way, or are we in a position now where we have to play catch up?
Well, I'll go first and then pass it to Erica. Okay. All right. So, well, listen, certainly our adversaries have organized themselves differently for this cyber fight, and particularly China 10 years ago, reorganized their whole strategic force element, to include rocket forces, space, cyber, information operations. And they organize themselves, I think, I'm not sure I would go that whole way, but certainly they recognize the value of unique kind of standalone cyber force for generation. And they certainly need it because they're generating a lot more forces than we are. I mean, they're significantly larger. That does not mean they're better, but they're larger. And why, how you build your infrastructure, how you train your people, we're still very good. That's not our complaint. Our complaint is that we're not achieving the readiness we want. So they're a good example. Among our allies in NATO and in Asia, I think we see them setting up unique forces, whether it's Japan, Australia, Germany. We're seeing countries start to do that. Now, we gotta be careful here because there's offensive and defensive capabilities here. Very few countries acknowledge publicly that they have an offensive cyber capacity or capability. So I want to be careful getting into too much detail there, but I'll tell you, I think we were the only ones who have such strong services and have this whole long-standing Goldwater Nichols issue that we're likely to suffer from this fourth generation challenge that we're looking at right now. I think most other countries would have jumped right into a single service. But Erica, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, it's actually, Mark, it's a great point about China. And one thing I just wanted to note, and this sort of came out over the weekend, and I haven't had a chance to dig deep into what the true China experts have been saying about this, but apparently the strategic support forces that Mark was referring to, which were created about 10 years ago, have just undergone a major reorganization, and they've now split out cyber, information, and space into separate arms. Which is interesting because now, at least based on just some of the public reporting that I've read, China is now sort of seeing these as standalone sort of missions requiring their own unique organization. What the implications will be for the long term and what the cause of this major reorganization of the strategic support forces is, I don't know. But it's just an interesting thing to reflect on that I'm sure we'll hear more about from China experts going forward. And to the Germany point, I think Germany just recently announced too that it is establishing its own independent sort of armed force for cyberspace. And then the other example, I think that's illustrative in terms of the allies and partners piece is the Israel example. Obviously, lots of reasons why the U.S. case is different from Israel, but I do think that when it comes to things like a bit more flexibility that a service would enable around who's the type of person who we would want to recruit into a cyber service, and what are the requirements for physical fitness, for grooming, for other types of standards that are less relevant for skilled, proficient personnel in the cyber domain is, I think, is one of those areas where we could draw some perhaps useful lessons.
Excellent. Thank you both. Next question. With the report public, how are you following up on the recommendations to support actual action by policy and lawmakers?
Yeah. So that's more on me. And, that's what, we do at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where there's a lot of think tanks in DC. We consider ourselves more of a do tank. So when we say we're going to, when we come with a policy paper, we don't bind it up, put it on the wall, get it framed or whatever. I mean, the whole idea is let's get some, executive order done, executive branch policy or legislative policies, or maybe state and local legislatures. But in this case, very specifically, we've certainly gone to the executive branch. I've gotten feedback from their leadership, which is uniformly along the lines of, we agree with your diagnosis, we disagree with the prescription. Which, of course, I'm like, well, the prescription is to have an open, transparent process. So which part of that do you disagree with? The open, the transparent, But so really, it's going to have to be, I think, the legislature. And so we'll go back. We've briefed a number of offices, and we'll see what happens. Can we get a floor amendment on this or markup? Something like that over the next few months. Look, my opinion is that we need to we'll probably need to move the senior leadership of the Senate and House Armed Services Committee, who are told by I worked on the Senate Armed Services Committee on a bipartisan basis. You tend to listen to DOD. Now, I worked for a leader, John McCain, who listened a little shorter and threw the BS flag a little faster. And I think he was pretty much uniformly correct in his decision making on that. As I look today at trying to get her, he pointed out that his big one was a big failure on the inability to get a relief aircraft for the A-10. And he said, you're not building one. The Air Force is like, don't worry, we're going to move our hands very fast and everything will be okay. He also pushed back hard on the idea that we would, have overhead imagery replace the AWACS. And sure enough, 4 years later, the Air Force is back saying, oh, by the way, we do need that new AWACS aircraft you talked about, 4 years ago. So generally speaking, he pushed back a little harder. I think this leadership team currently is trying to be cooperative and consensual with the Department of Defense. So they don't want to disagree with them, but we're going to try to demonstrate to them this is just a transparent, outside assessment. The cost of it would be, complete pocket lint in the DoD budget. They get budget money for reports and studies anyway, but dedicate one to this that's done on a fast track by a competent, agreed to outside observer, and get an assessment going. This should not, on its face, it should be easy. In practice, it's going to be hard, but I think we'll get there because, and look, if we don't get there this year, I got the adversary on my side. I had someone inside DoD kind of imply that, by writing these reports, we were helping China. Quite the reverse. China is going to prove that we're right, not that, we're wrong. China will continue to pressure. I think they're the pacing threat for us in cyber on the nation state level. I get that Russia's ransomware problem is the biggest contribution to criminal behavior, and the North Koreans are the biggest contribution to crypto criminal behavior in cyberspace. But China is the nation state problem. That's what Volt Typhoon is all about. That's what we're now really fully starting to comprehend, the degree to which they have, taken the measure of our critical infrastructure and put in a lot of malicious hardware. So my point on this is, you can start this transparent report now and get yourself ready soon, or you can wait till you get kind of a significant ass kicking and do it later. But one way or the other, you're going to do this study. You're going to find out that you need a cyber force, and you're going to implement it. And the idea that if we just wait a little bit longer, the problem's going to resolve itself. Well, we've been 12 years of waiting a little bit longer, putting a little bit more money in, tweaking the the legislation every year in the NDAA, and not getting the proper result. So, I say, to hell with that. Let's get this done this year in that fiscal year 25 NDAA.
Amen. It's been exactly 4 weeks since your report was officially published. This is plenty of time for the discussions to get going and both supporting and dissenting opinions to get thrown out there. What are some of the major comments that have been sent your way? And in particular, are there any vocal oppositions that you would like to address today?
Well, why don't you go first, Erica, since I already spent a little bit of time on that.
Sure. Well, I think certainly our report kicked off a vigorous debate, which I think is a good thing. And there have been lots of great conversations happening, both in public, in forums like these, online, in private conversations. And so I think it's all testament to really not to the work that we did. Obviously, I'm happy to give ourselves credit, but really to the voices of the people we interviewed, which I think is something that, at least from my perspective, is really what drove home the point that we were trying to make, was having this representation of 75 plus personnel across rank and grade and so on, and across services. So yeah, but in terms of major arguments against what we recommend, I think that there's still this, to me, what I see as the common thread is there's still this apprehension to making any sort of what's seen as kind of like a major, systematic change. And there's a preference for continuing to make these kind of incremental changes, whether it's, the recent enhanced budgetary control that Cyber Command was just granted, which gives it greater control over acquisitions for some set of resources. So that's been, I guess, the most common line of critique is that, well, it's better that we just try making these little fixes on the margins because a big fix will be too disruptive. And I think the reason why I don't find that convincing gets back to what I've said before about timing and what Mark has said before as well, is that, you don't, I think we're convinced, and we think the evidence is compelling, that at some point establishing an independent service is an inevitability. And so continuing on the path of incremental changes doesn't set us up for success when we actually need, like when the real fight happens, right? And we need to make sure that we are, organized and resourced and properly equipped and so on for it. And so I don't see that as being a particularly convincing argument. Yes, change is hard and there will be some short-term disruptions, but I would prefer to have that happen now rather than happen 5 years or 10 years from now. So that's sort of the main, I see that as being the main line of criticism. Another critique has been that, well, the services or the sort of existing services already don't prioritize cyber. And therefore, if you pull cyber out of the services, they'll prioritize cyber even less, which again, I don't find to be that compelling of a counterpoint, because you're effectively then rewarding organizations for suboptimal behavior, right? By continuing on the status quo. And so, yeah, those are sort of the two main lines of critique. But Mark, I'm sure you've heard other lines of criticism too.
Well, yeah, thanks. And, they are there's been some very thoughtful criticism, right? And I think most of it is around that argument that Erica laid out of, why make big change if we can make smaller iterative changes? That's a fair discussion. I think there's a compelling argument to make the big change, that the iterative changes will just extend the pain period till it gets too high, and then eventually you shift. But there's a thoughtful argument there, I think. So I don't want to be dismissive of critics. And maybe they're right. An outside assessment may come in and say that, but it's not thoughtful to say we disagree with what you're thinking about, and we don't even want to have a transparent, open outside assessment. I mean, that just strikes me as is not American in how you think about it. It's very authoritarian in how to approach something. I do want to mention something that Erica said. So we interviewed a lot of people for this, and I would say to a woman or a man, they all believed the status quo was not working. And these are people who'd either left the service or retired, ranks from E5 to 08. 100% the status quo is not working. Had we interviewed General Nakasone, I could say 101%, because I think he'd have agreed with that. They don't all agree on a cyber force, but a large percentage did. And so I think we need to hear those voices say, look, I've worked in this field for years. I've watched the money come in and we can't get the readiness out. Final thing I'll say on that is that we in Congress, we knew it wasn't working 5 years ago, and so did Cyber Command, because this enhanced budgetary control, and in fact, the whole kind of movement of acquisition to a COCOM, which is contrary to how Goldwater and Nichols want you to work with civilian oversight of acquisition. This was done by well-meaning congressional leadership, including supported by us in the Solarium Commission. Jim Langevin and Mike Gallagher, Representative Jim Langevin, now retired from Rhode Island, Democrat. Representative Mike Gallagher retired, Saturday, from Wisconsin, pushed through with help from Senator, King and then Senator Rounds in the Senate. A significant amount of legislation to allow for this acquisition. This was because the services couldn't do their jobs on the acquisition. They were talking about the systems infrastructure side, not the people side. And it's actually created a very uncomfortable position where I don't think we have the appropriate level of civilian oversight of that. When we created the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber, by the way, against the Department of Defense's wishes, and they now cite that as one of the reasons not to do this, is that we now have this great Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. You opposed that for 3 years. And, you can't get some of the rank kind of hypocrisy on some of this is rich. But I'll just say, that Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber does not have the proper toolkit to do the either personnel resource wise or authority wise to do that kind of acquisition oversight. And so I think it's going to stretch cyber very quickly. I think the J9 at Cyber Command, because we've grown that thing. I want to say from 70 up to 75 million was the initial one. And now it might be more in the, past 500 million kind of authority. We got to be careful with this. We are doing, cheetah backflips to correct problems in service performance elsewhere, rather than address the core issue, which is that we probably need a different way of generating force.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'd like to deep dive a little bit more into some of the high visibility counterpoint arguments that have been brought up. And, with your recommendation for an assessment and your personal belief that the assessment will find a cyber force is necessary, DoD has stated basically that a separate service and the requirements necessary to build one will be a distraction to readiness in this domain. What's your response to that pretty poignant counterpoint? Yeah.
And so, like I said, that to me, that's the thoughtful answer. It's wrong, but it's thoughtful. And what I mean by that is that, I think saying, look, we've spent the last 10 years trying to do an iterative approach. We can all agree the status quo is not working. That's code for it's not working. But let's go ahead and do a 13th year of this. That strikes me. I mean, what you said earlier, that's Einstein's definition of insanity, right? To continue to do the same thing, expect a different result. So my answer is if you think that we're reaching a peak in the competition with China and Russia in cyberspace, and that it's going to be better 3 or 4 years from now. So wait for that soft landing spot. Then you're the only person in America that believes. And I'll put the ODNI, Avril Haines, and the director of FBI, Chris Wray, is agreeing with me that things are going to get worse. So why would I delay taking the action to be ready, to that, some nebulous point in the future when things are better? No one in the intelligence community is saying things are about to get better. They're all saying in cyberspace, things are getting worse and going to get far worse. So attack the problem now. It is absolutely nonsensical to wait or to hope that iteration is going to get you there at this point.
Erica, did you have anything that you wanted to comment on that?
No, I think Mark got it. I would just say that, very briefly, just to add, I think that the question then is, at what point would, if we can all agree that a change is needed, at what point would we be okay with, taking that short-term risk and, moving some things around and doing some reorganization? It's just, I guess, reinforces the point that now is the time rather than in the future. So, yeah.
And let me pick up on that. This isn't about changing the forced employment model.
Yeah.
The actual imposition of our will on the enemy isn't done by, force generation in the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, or Air Force. It's done by Cyber Command as the force employer. We're saying don't mess with Cyber Command as a force employer. Give Cyber Command better tools. No one's saying they're getting the right tools. We had a service until 6 months ago, didn't even have a cyber officer, cyber force, right? They fought it. For a decade, the other services had all done it. And they're like, no, we'll try something else. And finally, the Congress had to order them to do it. What I love about the Navy is they now say, oh, this was a fantastic idea we had. And you're like, wait a minute. You fought it for like 3-4 years, maybe a decade, and then you were ordered to do it. Whatever gets you through the night, okay, you have a great thing. My point on this is, that this kind of a waiting process will not make Cyber Command a better force employer. What will make Cyber Command a better force employer is a better force generation model. And that better force generation model, in our opinion, is only coming through the creation of a dedicated military service.
Can I just add one more quick thing on top of that? Not to beat a dead horse, but I think, when Mark mentioned tools, it is about tools, like capabilities. It's about, resourcing and so on. But I think what it comes down to, what really distinguishes cyber is the personnel aspect, more so than almost any other domain, right? And that's something that's really hard to get right. And I think it's something that you can only get right through having a service that has the sole locus of responsibility for that part, for the identifying the right people, training them, educating them, and so on, right? Because this is reflected in the interviews that we did, right? There's a handful of highly competent people who are doing the work and sort of doing the work of many, right? And they're having disproportionate effects based on just being a single individual. So it's really, I think what distinguishes the cyber domain is the personnel aspect of it. And so even if you give Cyber Command more budgetary authority, right, and more service-like acquisitions authority, that doesn't solve the personnel aspect, right? So yeah, just wanted to add that.
Well, I don't think the horse is dead, because I'll just bring up one more thing here. You made me think of it. It's fantastic, Erica. So here's what I'd say. Just think about this. I'll take my F-22 analogy, or a Super Hornet analogy. It isn't like the aviation technicians in the Super Hornet squadron are building a new type of Super Hornet in a side corner, and they're calling a pilot saying, hey, man, come check this thing out, right? It's, the tools for our traditional kinetic warfare are designed and built and employed over decades by a bunch of primes. And I'm not, we could talk about fixing the acquisition process of DoD later on, but it is a fixed thing. Cyber Command is completely different. As Erica said, it's about people. It's about a human. A new tool is done by your technician in a corner, and he brings over the operator and says, look at this. You asked to be able to get inside through this kind of firewall, this kind of defensive system, and be able to penetrate and operate on this kind of server with this proprietary problem. And I have given you the Harpoon missile of that, whatever you wanted exactly to get that mission done. And I designed it myself over the last 3 weeks, and now you have that tool, or maybe the last 3 months, and you have that tool. That does not describe anything in the Navy, traditional Navy, Army, Air Force, Marine Corps combat arms. And so it is an inherently different thing. People inherently they are both the tool, SOCOM like saying this, people are the weapon. I get it. But in Cyber Command, in cyber forces, when done right, when generated properly, people do design the weapon on the spot and then design another one and then design another one and then design another one, and it's not being done by the primes. It's being done by the warfighter. It's a really different thing. And so I think that's one more reason why you got to get, a unique culture to work that issue, to tackle that issue, to treat the issue with that kind of, value. And I think in the Navy about where like the aviation engineering, maintenance officers sat in the food chain of Navy promotions and treatment and bonuses and things like that. It wasn't high, but, a computer warfare engineer or cyber warfare engineer developing, that kind of tool, that's going to be the right people doing that are going to need to be properly, trained, developed, and remunerated so that we can keep them and win the war. So, yeah, I think I'm glad we kicked that horse one more time.
I think one of the signs of a great conversation is the fact that both of you have already destroyed half of my follow-up questions.
Yeah.
So actually, I want to piggyback off of what you just mentioned. You used the words culture, and Erica, you talked about how it's all about people. Do you think the DoD's culture can accept a cyber force, especially when we're talking about this concept, as you mentioned earlier? We're not going to go be recruiting the jocks. We may have to take a look at, hey, this person that can't do push-up number 2 is still the person we need in this service, or somebody, tattoos on their face, or maybe a more colorful past. How's the DoD going to adapt to that culture? Do you think that's even possible in today's climate?
I'll start first and say, look, I got 2 teenage kids in college. You're really asking me, can DoD adapt to Gen Z? And I'll tell you, I'm not sure. I hope so. And so, yes, I mean, could DoD adapted to Billy Mitchell? Eventually, DoD, a war helped, but we can adapt, and so the answer is going to be yes. I give DoD a lot of credit. I mean, people look DoD, for 75 years has been the great, meritocracy in American society. It is, fed in. It is led the way in integration across races and genders and sexual preferences. It's absolutely, it eventually becomes a great driver of change. Not all, it needs to get tickled a little bit, to go do the work, but it really is this great melting pot of America. It's still the place to go. My belief on recruiting is that we're looking for kids who are running to something or from something. And are running to go get something, running from to get away from a bad situation. The military is a great place to anchor yourself, serve 5 years, decide, do I want to stay or do I want to take the GI Bill and make my own way through life? And both of those are great for America and great for the military because our former service members make the best recruiters. So yes, the military will respond to this. What's the exact culture of cyber force going to look like? I don't know, but it's got to be better as cyber force than as like a Marine Corps cyber force, a Navy cyber force, an Army cyber force, an Air Force cyber force. There's going to be a Space Force cyber force too, pretty soon. And so, that to me is that's a challenge that I think the DoD should be happy to accept, because in getting Generation Z right, or Gen Z right, they're going to get the cyber force culture right. So I'm confident. I have a lot of faith in DoD that once the right answer is accepted or forced or whatever, they then go kick ass with it. The problem is getting them to the right answer.
Yeah, and can I just jump in on that because I love that question. I think culture is, in addition to personnel, and these are related, right? Culture is so essential, and getting the culture right will be so important. And I think that organizational cultures change slowly over time, right? It's what a lot of the academic literature on strategic culture, on military culture tells us, but they can change, right? They're not. I don't think that the culture of the modern, U.S. Armed Forces today is the same at all to what it was 50 years ago, right? And so change is possible, but I think a lot of it will depend on the nature and composition of the early leadership of a, prospective U.S. cyber force, because leaders do have the opportunity to set a vision and a tone and a culture, for their subordinates, and so I think, thinking proactively about those kinds of decisions will be really important. Like who are the leaders that really need to be elevated, who can set the tone for the culture. The other thing too, I think, just underscoring the importance of culture, I think there's this misnomer that most of the retention problems in the military when it comes to cyber stem from the external financial incentives. So that people leave the service because they have better outside options financially. But I think if you look at the reporting on the surveys that the services have done about retention, at least based on what's publicly available, a lot of it comes down to culture and mission and leadership, rather so things that are sort of more intangible, but so important, less so than it does sort of basic financial incentives, right? Not that isn't an important sort of countervailing issue that needs to be considered, but to me, it just underscores like why it will be so important to get the service culture right. And it may take time to figure out what that means, right? Which means I think having organizational space and autonomy and flexibility to cultivate that culture and having the right leaders in place to help drive it will be really important.
And that reminds me two thoughts. One, and Erica's absolutely right. The money issue really came up more in the disparate money between the services, where two E5s with the same training, same time in service, maybe they have the same skill set, maybe they don't. The skill set's irrelevant, or performance is irrelevant. The pay differential between the two of them could be significant based on special duty assignment pay, bonuses, things like that. Having a cyber force would solve that problem. I do think it's that. Although I will say, I think NSA is like cherry picking of some of the really top performing offensive operators. They do use money in the end game to help, but I think what gets the kids going to it is the culture and the mission set at NSA, not the money. I think that's there. I do want to say something. Like Tim Hawk is like Paul Nakasone is fantastic. He helped set a great culture at Cyber Command, which is why Cyber Command, as force employer, is doing as well it is with a poor force generation capability. I think Tim Hawk's the right guy to help. He'll still be Cyber Command, but he can help as a cyber force develops, be that operational mentor to do it. This will be different than Space Force, where the Space Command and Space Force kind of generated at the same time and get regenerated. In this case, the Space Command regenerated. I think Cyber Command being there for 10, 12 years, having that strong leadership experience, having a proven leader like Tim Hawk in there is going to be really helpful. And I'll say, the new ASD, the acting Ashley Manning, is really strong organizer. And so that'll help with culture. And then Mike Sulmeyer is a known great quantity. He's nominated to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Cyber, the initial one. If they can get him over the hump, through confirmation hearings and then a vote in the Senate. And I think DOD is almost betting only on him for the summer. He is literally the DOD's number one push through, non-uniform push through. So that would be really important. That kind of having, can we have the right culture? Yes. It'll be driven by the right leaders. Tim Hawk, Ashley Manning, Mike Sulmeyer. Those are the right kind of leaders. And we've been, very fortunate to have had Paul Nakasone for 5 years. So from my perspective, the answer is yes. DOD will get there, and I just hope they get there sooner rather than later.
I want to point out something that's very hard to dismiss on the cover of your document. I know probably the camera can't pick this up, but this logo on the front very clearly says at the bottom, Department of the Army.
Yeah.
What can you explain a little bit of the impetus behind the recommendations in here that the Army actually takes on the cyber service versus it being wholly independent?
So here's the deal. We cannot set up a cyber force where we then say, by the way, we're going to set up a completely separate civilian secretariat. Space Force confronted the same thing. We suddenly, you need, it's like Noah's Ark. I need 2 lawyers for this and 2 lawyers for that and 2 HR people for this and 2 for that and 3, I guess 3s and 4s and acquisition and things and recruiting and and I'm like, and it generates more general officers and SESs, things that are very hard. So first, it's going to have to go into an existing service secretariat. We currently have Air and Space and Navy and Marine in the, Secretary of the Navy has the Navy and the Marine Corps. Secretary of the Air Force has Air and Space. I think Army would naturally be the right place for this to go. And then you get the acquisition oversight that I mentioned earlier. You get all that is added in. Look, do you have to add a few bodies to the, secretariat? Yes, but it's not extreme. It's very manageable number. So you're stopping the perturbation that everybody's worried about and the growth and the patrol and the fight for, space inside the E-ring, that set aside, that you get to avoid that. But the other important thing is I would say this is also acknowledging the Army, I think, in recent history, in the last 3 to 5 years, it's not like a gold medal performance, but they're the only one on the stand. They're getting a bronze medal, and everybody, the other services are like copper and tin, right? They are doing the best among the force generators. They've got great new facilities at Fort Eisenhower, down former Fort Gordon down in Atlanta, in Georgia. I think they're in a great position to do it. Look, the other services have good training facilities as well, and they'll still need them for some of their own defensive needs. But, I think the Army is the place to go with this. I think the Army Secretariat's the right place to go. And by the way, the Department of the Army has been having its sales trimmed pretty aggressively number-wise. I think I just saw the 25 NDAAs around 442,000, down from 505 just, half a decade ago. So, their end strength. So I think they're a good place. Their secretariat was geared for a larger force. So they could take this on, I think, in stride, in a way that the other services would struggle. The other secretariats would struggle if you gave it to them. So it's, this isn't because Erica worked at the Army Cyber Institute or anything like that, or I just like the Navy because I was in the Navy. It's not that at all. This is, I think, a logical conclusion of where he did it. I've got a lot of pushback on that, by the way, just as it happens. But maybe DOD doesn't really want to discuss the further on implications of decision making, and not a lot of pushback on that.
And just to build on that real quick, I think that, I obviously agree with everything Mark said, and think that placing a cyber force within the Department of the Army is the logical and practical recommendation if the cyber force is established. I do think, just getting back to the question of culture, it will be important to ensure that wherever a cyber force is placed, there is that autonomy to cultivate a unique service culture. But we've seen how that's possible if you look at the Marines and the Department of the Navy, right? Like the Marines certainly have a unique service culture, right? That is distinct from the broader Navy service culture. And so I think that for those who may be concerned about, the potential mismatch or tension between Army service culture and a cyber culture, which is unique, I think that just being deliberate about taking that into account and looking at other models will be really important.
And if you're worried that, cyber being inside the Army means that they'll have a muffled voice, I would point you to the Marine Corps as rank insubordination to the Secretary of the Navy that they practice on the Hill on a routine basis, arguing for a different force strength and amphibious strength. And whether they do it through silent, through quiet notes slipped to former Marines or Congress members or retired 4-stars, preaching from the same, missile, from the same prayer. It's clear to me, you can you could, within one secretariat, have two opinions or two cultures or two positions on just about anything.
Excellent. We are pretty much coming up right on time. So I want to, I guess, give one last opportunity for both Mark and Erica. If either of you have any, 2-minute summaries that you want to put out there, anything we didn't cover that you want to make sure gets mentioned.
Erica?
No, I think we covered a lot in this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much. I would just underscore that I think it is, both of us have been saying this, but I think the clear next step is an independent study, right? Which I think is a pretty low bar from my personal perspective. So while I think the two of us are convinced about what the appropriate solution is, I do think that we were able to interview the people we could interview, right? And an independent study would have greater access and remit and authority to do a more comprehensive assessment. And even if we take it as given that they would arrive at the same conclusion, I think it would have greater credibility, given the authorities that would have. So that would be just the point I would like to leave home with.
I'll let you go. We actually do have a couple of questions in the chat, but Mark, if there's anything you want to cover.
No,
first.
I'll answer those questions.
All
instead.
right. So first question, do you think the changing conventions of kinetic war, the use of unmanned drones, accelerates or changes the need for a cyber force or embedded capabilities in existing branches?
All right, I'll take a whack at that. So I think it accelerates it. I want to be careful. I don't want to say everything proves my argument or the argument, right? But what I would say is that we are, I don't know that we can write the joint warfighting, capabilities, the joint warfighting manual as fast as the battlefield is changing. What we've seen in Ukraine and Iran, or in Israel with Iran, what we see with how Taiwan prepares and for an evolving China. The reality is our adversaries are agile and dynamic and changing, and they're always looking for our weaknesses. So if our weakness comes that we can't generate sufficient offensive cyber force, then we can expect to see a lot of offensive cyber force thrown at us. So that's how I'd say that the changing nature of warfare does drive the need for us to be more dynamic and agile, and not say things like we're worried that making change will slow down, measurably slow down our ability to be ready for the next thing, when in fact making change is what makes you ready for the next thing. And the adversary is certainly practicing that.
All right. And second question, what role would U.S. Cybercom have in relation to the idea of standing up a new agency or command based on increasing the collaboration between all the different services?
So, look, if you stand up this new cyber force, you don't have the other services as they transfer. Cyber Command will be critical to helping identify what the cyber force should consist of. And we lay out a basic argument in our paper about how the first 8,000 to 10,000 people, and it should look like, recognizing it may eventually grow to 16,000 to 18,000 people. That's an estimate by us. That number could well be off. But Cyber Command will be critical to that. And look, Cyber Command is the beneficiary of an improved fourth generation process. They should always be critiquing it. What they can't do is run it. And Erica referred to this earlier, that the General Hawk, not only being Cyber Command, one of our combatant commands, not just any combatant command, one that's kind of in an active, low, simmering conflict, operating around the world. And then he is also happens to be the national security director of the National Security Agency, a pretty significant intelligence community player. The idea that same individual would also be responsible for fourth generation, so not reasonable. So what I would say is he's a good advisor to that process. He's a critiquer of the product of the process. And he can even make some recommendations on what forces should initially make up that process. But he is not the executor of the process. He is the force employer.
All right. Turns out I'm a liar. There's 2 more questions.
Okay.
Regarding proficiency of our cyber forces, Cyber Command and the services have used chiclet charts and checkboxes to measure readiness to perform. This is akin to using a measure of performance for producing a widget on an assembly line. The most capable cyber people who have mastered the craft and can employ an asymmetric mindset likely did not complete every course or spend a specific number of hours on certain tasks. How would a U.S. cyber force rethink and evaluate proficiency?
Well, I think, first and analyze the readiness through those particular charts is itself the challenge. I agree with that in reality, you need a much more dynamic process. So I would think that having a singular cyber force probably makes it easier to develop a comprehensive solution instead of hoping that 5 services can independently, and believe me, their cultures will kick in here and how they do assessment, arrive at a quality product by 5 different paths. I'd rather bet on the one path and then have an outside observer like Cyber Command critique. Did you get to the force I needed? You'll have a great judge, right? Cyber Force will be as a constant reminder that you're doing well or not doing well if you're a force generator.
Excellent points on providing upward mobility for youth that technology inclined. What sort of intermediate programs should younger people look for to bridge the gap between academia and the workforce? Training can be incredibly expensive. Work experience expectations seem to be almost more unrealistic. Great topics on adversity that definitely adds to inclusivity problems. Well, this isn't a question. This is a thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I should read ahead. So thank you to the panel for addressing this real issue. So thank you, Jonathan Kane, for providing that comment. Last question that just came in. Who do you believe are your best allies in Congress for a push in the NDAA?
I'm going to just leave that to myself. I don't need to. I found the Department of Defense is like a world-class targeteer. And whether it's a kinetic, whether it's a ship at sea, a submarine, an aircraft in the air, a missile in flight, I'm not gonna serve up targets to the Department of Defense. Let me just do my wrap, and I'll just say I'm really glad I could write this with Erica, but I'm really glad that that we had the voices of the participants, and it's worth, as you look through the report. I know you guys held it up earlier. It's online at ftd.org. When you look at that report, by the way, it was pulled down more times than any other report we've done at FTD. And we've done a lot of like game-changing reports on like Iranian nuclear program on a lot of other issues on forward defense and things like that. But this was pulled down more. As you look at that report, look at the comments. Erica was really much more careful than I to make sure that she pulled a quote from the different, from 50 or 60 of the 75 kids, it's spread, or young men and women, or men and women, are spread throughout that report. Those quotes they're not twisted, they're not taken out of context. They absolutely explain the challenge that the current force is experiencing in trying to generate a combat capability for Cyber Command as the force employer. So please look through the report. I want to thank Erica, and I want to thank you all for giving us the platform here to discuss this important issue.
All right. Well, I want to thank both of you for being here as well. Thank you, Dan, for helping me out on this panel, and a big thank you to the Technology Advancement Center that put on this event and hosting us here today. Thank you, everyone that joined us. And again, as Mark pointed out, if you'd like to download the report, it's available on the ftd.org website, and more information about AAUSCF is on auscf.org as well. Thank you.